Good morning. Thanks for getting up early. This is about rational expectations in heterogeneous Asian models. As was said, sort of to relate a little bit to yesterday's discussion, I guess it's to make sure there's not, I'm trying to make sure there's not too much convergence, I guess, maybe. And just as background, the background to this paper was I was invited to give one of these invited talks at the Royal Economic Society annual conference that came with a publication in the Economic Journal. And so I thought I'd sort of write up something that you maybe wouldn't be able to get through the normal referee process. And this is the outcome. So we'll see. Okay, so this is about heterogeneous Asian models with aggregate risk. There's these very well-known classic papers by Tony Smith and Per Crusell and Waterd and Han from the late 1990s, and a huge literature since then. Obviously relevant for the central bank. Like here, this whole literature on heterogeneous Asian New Keynesian models is in this realm. And you know, to put it somewhat provocatively and to sort of wake you up, in the morning, my argument in a nutshell will be what we're doing in quotation marks sort of makes no sense. And there's a particular problem, which is the assumption of rational expectations about equilibrium prices. On the next slide, there'll be a more nuanced version of this. Okay, I'll explain this in a bit more detail. And I'll say there's an interesting challenge to think about, namely, what should replace this assumption about rational expectations about equilibrium prices. And I want to be clear, I sort of don't know the answer. So instead, what I'm going to do is just sort of spell out some criteria that seem reasonable to me and discuss some promising directions. Okay, so here's a bit more detail. So the key problem in heterogeneous Asian models with aggregate risk, and this is sort of well known since these papers from the 90s by Crusell and Smith and so on, is that once you have the combination of rational expectations and general equilibrium, you have this sort of issue that the cross-sectional distribution, say the wealth distribution or the firm size distribution, so this infinite dimensional object enters households or firms' decision problems in the precise sense that you get a Bellman equation where this distribution is a state variable. Okay, this equation has gotten a name recently. This comes from the mathematics literature on sort of mean field games with sort of the math version of heterogeneous Asian models. They call it the master equation. There's some papers recently in the economics literature that use that terminology. This equation actually in the math literature is sometimes nicknamed the monster equation because these very, very good mathematicians like, say, Pierre-Louis Lyons, who's a field medalist, he's looking at this. He's like, this is the most complicated equation ever seen. So they call it sort of the monster equation to point that out. What's sort of interesting about this, if you think about this, is you have this distribution entering the household's decision problems, even though the households or the firms, so the agents in these models, don't actually care about the distribution directly. Instead, they only care about prices, right? So these models are standard competitive equilibrium models where there's agents are infinitesimal. They take as given prices. So it's not these models of like keeping up with the Joneses or anything like that, where the distribution enters directly. But nevertheless, you get this issue that the distribution enters the decision problem. So it's sort of worth thinking about why that happens, and I'm going to spell it out in the next slide in detail. But basically what's going to happen is that the agents in these models, the households of the firms, they're using the distribution, this extremely high dimensional object, to forecast the prices, which is a much, much, much lower dimensional object, which they actually care about. Okay. There's some recent work that's made some impressive advances solving such models. Bunch of citations here. This is all the good young guys who are kind of working on this. You can kind of guess what they're doing. So they're throwing like deep neural nets at this and so on. But I think it's fair to say this still really holds back the heterogeneous agent literature. So in particular, whenever you want to think about things where you can't necessarily linearize, for example, you want to think about, I don't know, nonlinearities like in a financial crisis, or if you want to think about the recent inflation debate, maybe there were some nonlinearities in the Phillips curve that were important, or asset pricing or these kind of things. You just can't do it with the current solution techniques for heterogeneous Asian models. Okay? In short, there's basically no efficient global solution method for heterogeneous agent models with aggregate risk. And I think, I mean, this is sort of related a bit to a discussion yesterday, and I'd ask about this. I think we ought to really have these global solution methods. What I think we ought to be able to do is kind of, for people who notice, Brunner, Meyer, Sannikov, with heterogeneous agents. So like these models where you have a bimodal ergodic distribution for the aggregate economy, or another way of putting it, maybe, for people who notice what the agent-based literature is doing, but, with the way we normally, so where you get these very interesting emergent behavior, interesting aggregate nonlinear phenomena, but, with our standard assumptions of forward-looking people who have some sort of expectations about the future. Okay, or maybe another way of saying it, for people here at the central bank, right, this is something that always struck me about linear models, right? In the linear model, if you think about, what should you do in a recession, say monetary fiscal policy, if you think about this without thinking about linear model, the first question you'd ask maybe is, why did the recession happen in the first place? Why is there a recession? In a linearized model, it kind of doesn't matter why the recession happened in the first place. The efficacy of monetary policy, right, is always going to be sort of additively the same, regardless of what the shock was that actually caused the recession. So sort of, do we believe that? And so that's a good question to ask yourself. Okay, so here's in a bit more detail the intuition, what happens in these models, which is the example I want to do is, suppose I live in one of our models, and I only care about one particular price, say interest rates. Say I want to buy a house, and I want to forecast what's going to happen to mortgage interest rates. So I only care about this one, scalar, one-dimensional squiggly time series there. Okay. Then if I live in one of our heterogeneous agent models, what I'd do is I'd realize that in equilibrium, this interest rate depends on the entire cross-sectional distribution. So in short, it depends on what everyone else does in the economy, or sort of really the world, if you want. Okay. So here I'm picking this sort of high-dimensional example distribution just to illustrate the point. Okay. And then I'd say, well, because I have rational expectations, in order to forecast this one-dimensional interest rate, I can't just forecast that directly. Instead, I need to use that mapping that I understand how the distribution maps into the equilibrium interest rate in order to forecast this one-dimensional object. Okay, so you're forecasting this infinite dimensional object, or if you discretize it, 100,000 dimensional object to forecast this one-dimensional object. Okay, and so my argument, basically, in a nutshell, is sort of, why are we making our life so hard? Sort of, if the best economist with the best algorithms and computers can't solve this problem, maybe it's a stretch that real-world people do this. Okay, so I'm basically arguing we're spending a lot of intellectual and computational horsepower solving what seems just like an unrealistically complex problem. Maybe there's some benefit of sort of going back to the drawing board and replacing the assumption of rational expectations about equilibrium prices. And the promise, I think, is sort of, I'll talk about this later, to sort of kill two birds with one stone a little bit. So to both make the computations easier and make the models more realistic and more likely to generate interesting phenomena, right? Normally these things fight with each other. You make the model more complicated, you make more models more realistic, you make it harder to solve. But here it's sort of these things can potentially go hand in hand with each other. And I'll talk about this more later. Okay. There's a longer version of this talk and paper on my website, which I'll have to sort of abbreviate a bit. There's a relatively long part in the beginning, which is sort of a brief history of economic thought, of rational expectations. So I went back and read all these beautiful old papers by Muth and Lucas and Prescott and Sargent. And one thing that's interesting to point out there is when these guys first developed rational expectations, it was actually all about how do people form expectations about equilibrium prices. Now there's a lot of work on non-rational expectations. A lot of that is sort of non-rational expectations about exogenously determined state variables, which is all very good, but I think it would be nice to go back actually a little bit to this original problem. In fact, actually, there's some parallels to what I'm going to say in work that's even before rational expectations was developed. This is in the appendix. You can look it up. There's a nice paper by Oscar Morgenstern from like 1935 where he criticizes perfect foresight in general equilibrium models, which is sort of has a lot of parallels of the things I'm going to say. Okay, second part, I'm going to talk about why I think that there's something wrong with the assumption of rational expectations in heterogeneous agent models. Third, I'm going to talk about alternatives. And sorry, this is from a different slide set. I'm not going to have time there. One particular approach to doing this. Okay. The one thing I want to say about the history of economic thought piece is, if you go back to reading these older papers, which I really recommend you do, they're very nice. One thing this literature always emphasizes is that one goal of developing rational expectations was to develop sort of what they always call sort of operational macro theory. So if you read back, if you look back at this very important Lucas and Prescott 1971 paper, Investment Under Uncertainty, they really emphasize this operability aspect. There's also this very nice, I think well-known quote by Lucas from this methods paper, and he says, our task, as I see it, is to write a Fortran program, right, that will accept specific economic policy rules as input and will generate as output statistics describing the operating characteristics of time series we care about, which are predicted to result from these policy. So, a model you can solve on a computer and do policy counterfactuals with. It's a pretty good description of academic macroeconomics, this quote, I'd say, right? And I guess my point will be a little bit that in representative agent models, rational expectations sort of has really worked out well in terms of contributing this operability. So you're making these models actually easy to solve and do stuff with. But I want to sort of say in heterogeneous agent models, it actually makes it more difficult. And so just from a pragmatic sort of a point of view, maybe it's worth thinking about other assumptions. Okay. So here's what's going on. I already kind of explained this intuition that you want to really forecast this very low dimensional object, this interest rate, but you're forecasting it using this extremely high dimensional distribution. What I want to do next is sort of flesh this out with some equations and explain it in a bit more detail. Okay. The example I'm going to have is completely standard in textbook, and not because I think it's a particularly interesting model, just for sort of pedagogical reasons. Okay. In particular, the example I'm going to have is forecasting equilibrium prices like a wage and an interest rate in a real business cycle model with heterogeneity. In the paper, I should say, I actually first do this in a real business cycle without heterogeneity, so just in a representative agent model. You can already see kind of a bunch of things there, but here I'm abbreviating this. Okay, so here's the model. This is really totally standard. This is Crusell-Smith 1998, but with endogenous labor supply, basically. So competitive equilibrium here is some quantities and prices where the prices are wage and interest rate, such that the households maximize their utility function, which is over consumption and labor, and is labor, subject to a budget constraint, which says a consumption plus saving equals income. And there's some firms. There's in particular a representative firm that just maximizes profits. There's an aggregate productivity shock, Z. That's like the aggregate shock that hits the economy. And then there's some market clearing condition. Sorry, I should have said this. Why is this a heterogeneous agent model? What's the heterogeneity? So basically, right, the way this works, there's going to be heterogeneity in the wealth A and the income Y. Where does this come from? It comes from the fact that there's idiosyncratic labor productivity shocks. Sometimes you're employed, sometimes you're unemployed, and so on. And then basically there's heterogeneity just because some people get lucky and some people get unlucky. Okay. One important thing to point out, if you look at this model, the agents, the households, or the firms, they don't care about the distribution directly, right? If you look at this does work, but if you look at this households problem, there's no G, which is the distribution. There's no G anywhere in this problem, right? There's just like the prices, W and R. So you only care about the prices, but nevertheless, as I'll show you, what will happen is that the distribution will show up in the decision problem. Okay. Okay. So here's how this works. So let's think about the determination of equilibrium wages for now, and then things for interest rates will be parallel. So the way it works, right, is you from the households optimization problem, you can find a a labor supply function, basically. Important feature of this labor supply function is that, in general, except if you rig it in some way, this labor supply function will not just depend on the wage. It will also depend on the household's idiosyncratic state variables, in particular their wealth and their income, right? Except if you had sort of GH8 preferences, say, where you assume away income effects on labor supply. This is going to be a generic feature that policy functions here, in particular labor policy function, depends on the household's idiosyncratic states. Okay, from the firms, things are simpler, and there's just a represented firm, so you get a labor demand curve. That has labor demand as a function of the wage and the economy's aggregate state variable. And then you have a market clearing condition. Okay? Now think about what happens when you combine sort of the labor demand and labor supply and the market clearing condition, and what the determination of the equilibrium wage is. Well, you're going to have an equilibrium wage that depends on the entire cross-sectional distribution of wealth and income. Again, where does that come from? It just comes from the fact that every household, in principle, supplies a different amount of labor depending on their circumstances. Okay, so as a result, necessarily, you're going to have this very complicated sort of equilibrium price functional, where the equilibrium wage depends on the entire cross-sectional distribution. Note this is a generic feature of all heterogeneous Asian models, right? So I'm writing here on the last bullet. So all heterogeneous Asian models that we always write, generically, you're going to have some vector of equilibrium prices that I call here P. That's going to be some functional or some sort of function of a function of some cross-sectional distribution over some idiosyncratic state variables X. Okay, and the point is, I guess, we just need methods that solve these kind of models. Okay, and the point is, rational expectations make this very hard, and there's other ways of doing it that would make it simpler. Okay. So here's why rational expectations makes it hard, okay? So again, I've already said this in words. This is sort of the key slide, I think. If you understand this slide, you really understand the problem at a sort of a deep level. So again, with rational expectations, you get this issue that the agents forecast these low-dimensional prices by forecasting these extremely high-dimensional distributions. You can see this nicely in a special case with 2 time periods. You may have seen on the previous slide, I had a capital T, and so I'm just going to make that 2 time periods, and let's just focus on the households problem here. So this here is the value function, right, of a household at time 0 in the first line with wealth A and income Y, so their income state whether they're employed or unemployed and so on. In the second line is the value function. Again, of a household with wealth A prime and Y prime, in the second period, and then the world ends after the second period, right? So this is time period 1, and the world ends. So as usual, in 2-period models or finite time models, it's useful to solve this sort of by backward induction. So look at the line for V1 first, the value function in the second period, and think about the decision problem of someone who just wakes up in the second period, in the final period, and they see a distribution Z prime and an aggregate shock realization Z prime, and as a result, they see some equilibrium prices W1 star and R1 star. Okay, that's just a static labor supply decision, like an intertemporal problem. That's a straightforward problem to solve here, right? So the households see the wage and the interest rate. They take that as given, and they just maximize. Okay, so that part's fine. The issue arises in the first period, so time period 1, right? In particular, you can see that in time period 1, the household, because they're forward-looking, they're not just solving a labor supply decision. Instead, they also have to decide how much they consume and how much they save. Okay, and then the problem is they need to form an expectation over the future prices, the W1 star and the R1 star. Okay, and then what happens is that basically, is what I said in the introduction, they realize that the W1 star and the R1 star, they depend on the entire cross-sectional distribution. And so as a result, what they do is they forecast that entire cross-sectional distribution in order to forecast these very low-dimensional prices. So that expectation operator in the first line is taken with respect to all possible future realizations of the cross-sectional distribution G prime there, right? And so that's why you have this infinite dimensional state variable showing up there. Okay, that is the problem at a deep level. Okay, and you have something similar for the firms and so on. So this is sort of for people to make the connection. This is a baby version of what the math literature on this mean field games, which is again just the name for heterogeneous Asian macro, I would say, in the math literature, called the monster equation or the master equation. That's what makes the solution so hard. And again, my argument is sort of, why making our life so hard? This seems a bit of a stretch. That if we can't solve this on a computer, maybe it's also not too hard a problem for people to solve. Okay. Okay. So brief taking stock and then going to the alternatives part. So again, if you read this, the goal of Muth and Lucas and co. was developing these operational macro theories. I'd say rational expectation achieves exactly this goal in representative Asian models. You may not like it for other reasons, right? You may not like it in particular because you think it's inconsistent with empirical evidence on how people form expectations. But in terms of practical, ability to do stuff with the models, I think it works very nicely. Okay, but in rational expectations in heterogeneous Asian models, sort of in a sense applies that these models, once you have proper aggregate risk, are sort of not operational anymore. Why? Because it attributes to people this extreme ability to think through equilibria, and means that people forecast distribution prices by forecasting distributions, thereby making the solution extremely hard. I should have said this earlier, and I do this in the longer paper. I mean, in a sense, like none of this logic is like exactly special to heterogeneous Asian models, right? You can make similar arguments in representative Asian models as well, that they have to think through the equilibrium and forecast. But so basically what's true here is sort of just all the same things that are true in a representative Asian model are sort of true on steroids in a heterogeneous Asian model. But there's one thing that's a little bit different, which is just the forecasting problem of an agent inside the model is just harder, right? The spirit of rational expectations in a sense is you want to assume that people inside the model are like sort of good statisticians, right? In a representative Asian model, it's not too hard to be a good statistician inside the model, which is also reflected in the fact that the solution method is not so hard. In a heterogeneous Asian model, it's extremely hard to be at least a perfect statistician because you have to forecast this infinite dimensional object, and that's the sort of underlying Markov state variable of the economy. Okay, and that's I'm just saying like maybe we should just model people as being sort of good statisticians but not perfect statisticians in a sense. Okay, so. Again, my argument is sort of we should maybe think about going back to the drawing board a bit, bringing back, I guess, in particular some old ideas. I'll talk about this later, and replace the rational expectations equilibrium heterogeneous Asian models. There are some existing attempts to do this, like Crucell-Smith 98. You can think of as a bounded rationality thing in a way, but I think could pay to be more systematic. And again, the payoff could be this sort of killing two birds with one stone idea. Okay. So then in the last sort of 7 minutes, let me talk about what can you do instead. And again, I want to be clear, I only know the problem, not the solution. We're working on some follow-up projects with some ideas, but I think there's a broad set of things you can do that are kind of sensible. And so what I'll do instead is sort of just spell out some criteria that I find reasonable, and then maybe we can have a conversation about these. A common element in all of these will be that agents, I will just assume that agents form expectations about these equilibrium prices directly in some way, rather than forecasting them indirectly by forecasting this extremely high dimensional distribution. That seems to me like the natural solution, just like from introspection. Like, how do I forecast interest rates? I come up with some sort of statistical law of motion for what interest rates are going to be. Maybe it's just like a random walk, maybe something more complicated. Again, note this is different from rational expectations where you do this indirect forecasting problem. The big problem, of course, or the big challenge is going to be how do you discipline these probability distributions to compute these price expectations? So where do you take subjective beliefs from? And that's I think where all the discussion is going to be about. Note in all of what I'm going to say, I'm going to keep the rational expectations about non-equilibrium variables, in particular the idiosyncratic labor income, say, in this model that I showed you. Why? just because for pragmatism, that's not where the problem comes from. Again, there's some nice empirical evidence coming out that people have subjective beliefs about their income process, say that's not rational, but that's just an orthogonal kind of issue, which is very interesting, but that's not what this is about. Okay, so here's in a nutshell what I think a natural solution looks like. Remember this two-period example I showed you, sort of this baby version of the master equation, where you have this infinite dimensional cross-sectional distribution showing up as a state variable. Okay, what I would just want to do instead is, suppose you gave me, from somewhere, God gives you from heaven, gives you a subjective beliefs that people have about future prices. So suppose someone just tells you this is the probability distribution over future prices that people use. Okay, then you're done basically, right? So you immediately went from, say you have this p distribution here. You immediately went from, there's a distribution, there's a Bellman equation which has a distribution as a state variable, to one where you just have these prices as a state variable. Okay, so you go from a problem with an infinite dimensional problem here. This is just a 4-dimensional problem. We can solve 4-dimensional Bellman equations. That's fine, right? But of course, the big issue is like, where do you take that probability distribution from? Where do you take these beliefs from? Okay, let me skip this. Okay, so the big challenge, the big question, and this is sort of, again, nothing new, people have thought about this, is, people need to compute these expected values because they're forward-looking, and where do you take that probability distribution from? In the words of, I think this comes from Tom Sargent, the challenge is basically how do you sort of navigate the wilderness of non-rational expectations. There's a very nice, for people who haven't seen this, AA presidential address by Tom Sargent, and he puts this nicely. He sort of says, there's such a bewildering variety of ways to imagine discrepancies between objective and subjective distributions, right? That's the key issue. There's a very nice footnote after that sentence in Sargent. He says, there's an infinite number of ways to be wrong, but only one way to be right, right? So that's kind of the key challenge here. So what's a reasonable way to be sort of slightly wrong here? Okay. So here's some criteria for forming these price expectations. And I think this is where a lot of the discussion is going to be or should be. So again, there's some price vector, say the interest rate and the wages, and you need to come up with some subjective beliefs about these that then people use to compute these expected values. Here's 3 criteria that sort of I thought were sensible. Okay. And I'll go through these in turn after the overview. So the first one is you want something that simplifies the solution, the computational solution of these heterogeneous Asian models, and in particular makes them operational. The second is you want some consistency with empirical evidence on expectations formation. And the third one is you do want some endogeneity of beliefs to model reality. So in particular, you want some immunity to some version of the Lucas critique. Okay, so let me go through these in turn. The first one, so just computational tractability. When I first thought about this, I thought this wasn't going to have much bite. I'm sorry, I should have said one more thing. I guess the hope is that somehow the intersection of these 3 criteria is sort of, relatively narrow, right? Like, so that this helps you navigate this wilderness of non-rational expectation, right? If you think about some sort of a Venn diagram where all the possible beliefs are, that the intersection is kind of narrow. I don't think there's going to be like a single right way to do it, but there's going to be a bunch of sensible things you can do. So the first thing actually, so it's good if these criteria have bite. The first thing actually has a lot of bite. In particular, it kind of takes off the table all models that nest rational expectations as a special case or where you start from rational expectations. In particular, there's a lot of models out there that are kind of a little bit like this. So you first compute the rational expectations, and then there's some parameter theta where you twist the probability measure and you overweight some states a little bit and you underweight some states. Like very well-known version of this is diagnostic expectations. Another version of this is Xavier Gabex has this nice thing called cognitive discounting. All of these are kind of out off the table here. Why? Because you're sort of you have to first compute the rational expectations case, and then you can only compute the non-rational expectations case. So this sort of strictly more complicated the agent's decision problem than with non-rational expectations. Let me go on. So there's a large literature on survey expectations in particular, and I think we need to kind of take this empirical evidence on board. There's this nice quote by Tom Sargent who sort of says, rational expectations is a communist assumption, right? Because everyone has the same beliefs. And I think we need to basically, if you look at survey expectations, there's evidence that this is not what the world looks like. And finally, I'm sort of running out of time, but let me just briefly say, so you don't want to go all the way back to the 70s, right? You do want, some endogeneity of the beliefs, and so some immunity to Lucas critique. I have to skip this. I think in the end, what I'm going to say is a natural solution is some sort of learning, okay? And so there's this older literature on like least squares learning. There's a very interesting computer science literature on reinforcement learning and psychology. I think these kind of ideas could be interesting here. Okay, so let me just wrap up. So what's the summary? So I think we're spending a bit too much intellectual computational horsepower solving these unrealistically complex problems, and we may want to replace rational expectations. And I just spelled out 3 criteria that seem reasonable and discussed some promising directions. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So the discussant is Laura Gati from the ECB. Thanks.
So first of all, thank you very much for asking me to read and discuss this paper that I've been thinking about for a while. Let me note real quick that since I'm at the ECB, these views are my own. Okay, so let me summarize real quick what Ben is laying out here. So in an equational form that many of us are familiar with, you can think of the solution to DSG models as a solution to a nonlinear system of equations in jump variables y and state variables x, so of this form, where f is a nonlinear functional. And so one of the features of rational expectations that is key to the challenge that Ben points out is model consistency. What model consistency means is that the expectations of a process, so here of the jump variables, is the same process as the process for the variable itself, which is really great in representative agents models, because there we can simply, when we assume a representative agent new Keynesian model, and we assume rational expectations, you can simply substitute in the same process form for the 2 variables, and you can solve this system pencil and paper as the solution of a fixed point problem. Also oftentimes imposing, but not necessarily linearity. So under rank, this really simplifies our lives. However, the Hank system, as Ben has explained very well, there is a distribution state, which I have denoted with D, which has a difficult expectation. So the problem in Hank is that prices depend on this distribution state. And therefore, when agents are computing price expectations, they need to take expectations of this difficult distribution state. And so when you add rational expectations to a Hank model, you get the computation of this difficult expectation, which is further complicated by the fact that if you want to investigate nonlinearities, which is one of the important premises of the Hank literature, then you also have to compute the expectation of a nonlinear function of this distribution state. And the numerical solution requires all agents to compute this, so you get like a doubly infinite state space problem. And so Ben outlines some criteria for getting around this problem. The first is that it needs to make the solution computationally tractable, which makes sense. This is the core principle of the problem. But then it should also be consistent with empirical evidence, and it should also address the big elephant in the room, in that it should be model consistent to some degree, in the sense that if we want to do policy counterfactuals, we need to be able to be robust to the Lucas critique, at least to some degree. Okay, so this is basically a challenge to macro at large, but in particular, it's like a cry out for expectations people like myself to think about coming up with solutions to this problem. And so I've been thinking about solutions to this problem for a long time. And so I'm going to use the discussion to present the first findings of my work on this. So the naive gut response that you would have looking at this problem is that, well, the trouble is coming from this difficult expectation. So in terms of expectations, let's just take the opposite extreme, the simplest that we can come up with. So a subjective expectation that is maybe the current value, or maybe even something even simpler, just a steady state value of the distribution state. Yay, we've solved the computational problem. But this is wildly not model consistent, so we are really up against criterion 3. So that's not going to do. So so basically the challenge boils down to kind of reconciling these two criteria that are in a tension with each other. And so the challenge is going to be, how can we find a minimal deviation from model consistency under rational expectations that is going to still simplify our computational problem? And in my thinking on this, I realized that, as Ben mentioned, a form of this problem also shows up in the representative agent version of the model, namely in the following way. So model consistency in the representative agent new Keynesian model means that expectations are jump variables, which makes that criterion very hard to reconcile with the patterns of expectations that we see in the data. In the data, we see a lot of sluggishness, underreaction, overreaction, and in particular, we also see delayed overshooting, which means that expectations behave in hump shapes after shocks. And so you can address sluggishness by relaxing full informational assumptions, but the delayed overshooting has been really difficult. Models have struggled to match that, unless you impose exogenous bells and whistles into the model. And so basically what I'm suggesting here is that in rank there is a similar challenge, which is what are models away from full information and rational expectations that can reconcile Ben's criterion 2 and 3, so data consistency and model consistency. And so what I'm going to show you here is a first report on my attempt to tackle this challenge, at least in what I think is the first step, the rank environment. And then, I'm hoping to move on to the Hank environment. So what I'm going to show you here is the first results from new work that I have ongoing. The attempt is to have the minimal deviation from full information and rational expectations in a rank model. And so the backdrop is the plain vanilla 3-equation new Keynesian model, where all variables up to time t, and including time t, are observed. And the only deviations from full information and rational expectations are the following. So I assume that agents don't know the inflation process, so this is the deviation from model consistency. But the key assumption is that the beliefs of the inflation process are correctly specified, i.e. they have the correct equational form, which I call weak model consistency. And the key element of this is that they are not model consistent with respect to the data generating process that it would be under rational expectations. They are correct with respect to the data generating process that is the true data generating process in this model. So I'm happy to talk about this in detail in the coffee break. But here I just want to point out that this is related to notions of internal rationality that Klaus Adam and Marcet have emphasized, or to the temporary equilibrium or reflective expectations of Garcia-Schmidt and Woodford. And the other key element that I want to emphasize is that so far so good. You can think that, well, an adaptive learning model would fulfill these conditions. But I'm also going to deviate from those traditions by introducing a new expectations forecasting rules updating that's going to be optimal given the informational environment. So in other words, agents are going to be using information optimally, which is one of the key features that Muth emphasized in his definition of rational expectations. And this is also going to be crucial. Okay, so this is basically my last slide where I show you what this model is able to produce in terms of expectations responses and inflation responses to a cost push shock. And I'm contrasting my model in red to a rational expectations version of the new Keynesian model and what I call a naive away from fire approach, which is really just a constant gain adaptive learning model. And so what you can see is that after a one standard deviation cost push shock, long-run inflation expectations obviously don't move in the rational expectations case, but also in the naive approach, they barely move and then they just very sluggishly move back. Whereas in my model, because expectations are updated optimally, long-run expectations actually have this hump shape, okay? Which is basically due to the optimal way that agents are trying to understand whether shock processes are persistent or temporary. So my model is able to generate this delayed overshooting pattern of expectations without any recourse to any bells and whistles. And furthermore, what that does is that as opposed to the rational expectations case and the naive away from fire approach, my model also gives you a hump-shaped inflation response following the cost push shock, again emphasizing that there are no exogenous persistence assumptions in this model. So it's also able to sort of resolve kind of decades-old issues in macro, trying to match dynamics of observables following shock. So this is really just coming through the expectations propagation. Okay, so that's the report on ongoing work that tried to address the challenge that Ben posed to us, the expectations folks. And so basically what I learned, and I hope you learned it with me now, is that there's a tension between Ben's criterion 2, consistency with data, and criterion 3, model consistency in rank as well. And to resolve it in rank, what you need is you need information frictions about the data generating process. You need correctly specified beliefs, what I call weak model consistency, so correct to the equations that generate the data in the model, and belief parameters that are updated optimally so that agents don't leave any information on the table. And so the next step is going to be to generalize this to Hank. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Ben, do you want to respond while the audience thinks about questions?
Yeah, very briefly. Yeah, just to say that it's really great to see expectations people like you pick up on this and think about these issues. These impulse response functions look very promising and exciting, so I look forward to talking more. More generally, I think, so I'm co-editing the AAR right now. If I think about like the two main stacks of papers that land on my desk, it's like heterogeneous agent papers and expectations papers, and those literatures don't talk to each other much currently. Okay, and I think it'd just be really great if people talked more, and there were like sort of some. I think there's lots of gains from trade on the table, basically from that. So that's all.
Thanks. Let's then open up the floor. So we'll collect a couple of questions. Question over at the back. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Ben. Alessandro Lin from Banca d'Italia. Thanks for the presentation. Very insightful. I want to push back a little bit on two aspects that you touched upon. So the first one is, I want to go back to something that was discussed yesterday, which is, the model is related to the question that we are looking at. And so, if you're interested in understanding heterogeneity and on a business cycle dimension, then we do have existing efficient solution methods to look at Hank models with aggregate uncertainty. So I guess that's something I want to hear what you think about. And the second thing that I want to push back a little bit on is the motivation that you brought up about the unrealistic assumption about households making all these forecasts. So imagine that you take our baseline Hank model and then you add a sector with professional forecasters. Okay, they're gonna do the job. They're gonna take the probability, distributions, and so on, market clearing conditions. They're gonna give you the prices, which I think it's a reasonable way of modeling that. But then operationally, the model wouldn't change because agents would still take the prices as a given. So then probably the motivation for your paper is more about the inconsistency between the data on beliefs and the fact that we have heterogeneous belief, as opposed to saying that agents in the model need to make these forecasts. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Oresta, and then Larry, and then we'll...
No, maybe... Is it on? Oh.
Yeah, it's on, yes.
A bit of a follow-up, and so so it seems to me that the key issue that you're concerned with is really this nonlinearity, and I mean it's a very ambitious goal, of course, but I was also wondering, one of the reasons why a lot of analysis, again also in the standard rank framework, has been based on linear models, is that there are many dimensions over which the models are, the assumptions we have in these models are not completely realistic, let me say. So, we, at the same time as the issue that you pointed out, we know that everyone in the model knows the model. There's no model uncertainty. There is complete information. And as a result, I've always had this intuition that linear models are useful because they give us, a first order pass at some questions, cutting through all these many different dimensions over which the models could be made more complicated. So I was wondering about what you think about these other dimensions as well.
Thanks, then Larry, and I think Guido, you wanted to ask a question as well. Larry, it's
going to be hard to remember everything.
a bit short on time, so I thought I'd collect.
Is this work? Yeah. So a very nice presentation, and I was wondering what Lucas would say to you if he was sitting here, and I'm quite sure that he would completely agree with you. And I get this in part from section 6 of his 1978 paper on asset prices. He only thought of rational expectations as something to which you would converge to if you followed rules of thumbs and learning he had in mind, over a long period of time. And if he saw the world we now live in, what I think he would find is that there are things happening all the time that now I'm probably saying something Olivier should be saying, but we see things now happening every 5 years that we didn't even include in our probability distribution. So rational expectations is impossible. And we have to have endogenous expectations that respond to events.
Last question, Guido.
Yeah, I already have a mic. I don't know if I can ask a question.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay. It's a great presentation. I really enjoy it, and I agree with the agenda. I suspect there may be potentially interesting directions there that capture also the nonlinearity. That when we think about crisis, a lot of what we think about crisis is that based on just the prices that we observed, most people can't imagine the crisis is coming. But at the same time, something is changing in the distribution, maybe of the debt position of the households or in the debt position of the corporate sector, that are actually kind of putting us closer and closer to a crisis. So it's all about the fact that if we condition expectations on a limited set of state variables, maybe today's prices, we can't see where the economy is going. And then the economy goes somewhere where actually suddenly we have to learn very fast because things are changing a lot. So even just the endogenous dynamics of crisis may be more interesting in the world you're imagining.
let me give you a quick chance to respond.
Great. Thanks so much for all these really, really great questions. Let me take maybe Larry and Guido first, because they're, I think, fastest. So yeah, I agree with you, Larry, that I think someone like Bob Lucas would actually sort of agree with the spirit. I think a lot of this is very much in the spirit of what these guys were trying to do when they're developing rational expectations. If you read all these old papers, it's exactly so emphasizing there should be some connection between the subjective beliefs and the objective model-generated probability distribution. And there's some quotes that sort of really emphasize that, and then they say, okay, one useful thing you can do is you can just equate them. But it's sort of not the only thing you can do. And again, like people like Tom Sargent has worked a lot on learning models that are exactly in the spirit of where I want to go. So yeah, I think that's right. To Guido, yes, I agree with you. So one interesting thing then to do would be in these models to not just have people forecast the prices directly, but then include some additional sort of state variables, like the fraction in the population that have like really large mortgage debt, or like and so on, and you could maybe get some interesting dynamics out of that. And then to the Alessandro and Orestes question. So first about the nonlinearity versus linearity. Yeah, of course it depends on the question. I completely agree with you there. I would say though that I do think for lots of questions you can think about nonlinearity. At least my intuition is could be potentially important. I think. I mean, let me take a step back. I think it's fair to say that we still don't really understand what drives business cycles. Okay, or like why are there large recessions and booms? I think after however many years of modern macro, I don't think we have like a super good answer to that. If you look at business cycles, there's always these sort of very large drops of a cliff, like in a recession, and then it's sort of a slow recovery. Doesn't look like very linear to me, and so maybe there's something to learn if you look at these nonlinear models. Again, I don't have proof of this. The other thing is, just because linear approximation, this is sort of related to what Larry said yesterday. In an RBC model, linear approximation works very well. But just because it works in a particular class of models doesn't mean that it works always, right? It's like a bit like Crucell-Smith. Like heterogeneity doesn't matter in some models, but it matters in some other models. So, just because you have some examples where it works doesn't mean it generally works. The final question, remind me, what was your first question again?
The first one, Mark.
It's okay.
The first one was about the model being related to the question. Then the second one was about the trillion forecasters.
Oh yeah, that's right. So yeah, so that's a really excellent question. So of course, like agents in the economy differ in their degree of sophistication, and some agents in the economy may well forecast solve much more complicated forecasting problems. It's particularly if you think about financial institutions or something like this, right? Which I think is sort of what you're thinking about. I would say two things. The first thing is, even if you want to model financial institutions, I don't think any of them solve literally like a forecasting problem where you include what everyone does, like the entire distribution in the forecasting model. They may solve much more sophisticated and high-dimensional problems than the individual households, your average Joe, but it's still nowhere near that. The other thing is, I don't think it's true that just because like someone does the forecasting, someone else can just like not do the forecasting. I mean, whenever you solve a dynamic decision problems, you have to forecast these prices. And it just so happens that in a complex system, like a heterogeneous agent model, the prices basically, they follow these extremely complicated stochastic processes where you have an underlying Markov process that's a distribution. That's the issue, right? And there's the only way to forecast that directly is to forecast the infinite dimension or the distribution. There's just no other way of doing it. This is sort of a statistical fact. And so you need to kind of come up with a simpler way of forecasting, basically. And that's, I guess, my point, right? Like, how do we come up with sensible, good forecasting models that describe well how people actually forecast that are simpler than people literally forecasting infinite dimensional Markov processes? That's it.
Great. Thanks very much. We should move on, but thank you again.